40 years after a young soldier vanished without a trace, a construction crew digging on an abandoned military ridge makes a horrifying discovery. A skeleton hidden just beneath the soil, still wearing its rusted dog tag. The name stamped into the metal? Kelvin Bush. But that wasn't the most shocking part. His bones revealed something the military never wanted the world to know. He hadn't gone AWOL. He'd been silenced. And when investigators finally uncovered the truth, it pointed to a conspiracy so dark, even decades later, it refused to stay buried. Before we dive deeper, hit subscribe for more unsolved cold cases and chilling mysteries. They found the bone on a Tuesday, when an ordinary town took on the hush of something sacred. The excavation crew had been clearing a low ridge behind the old National Guard training ground for a new subdivision. It was a place the town had learned to pretend wasn't there. The scrubby pines and forgotten berm that had swallowed decades of rain and rumor. Miguel Alvarez found the bone with the back of his hand, as if the earth had been trying to flick a truth into daylight. He called the crew foreman. The foreman called the county. Within an hour, the ridge swarmed with men in vests and reporters with cameras, and the ridge began to give up not a single bone, but an accusation. By the time the coroner arrived, the rumor that had slept in people's throats for 40 years pressed against every mailbox in town. Kelvin Bush. Missing soldier. Disappeared 1985. Never found. Never explained. The words had been breathed in lonely kitchen conversations, heaved into police reports that aged into file folders with yellow tabs, and were now being dragged unwilling into bright light. Kelvin had been 22 when he vanished. He'd been the kind of young man whose laugh could tilt a room. His mother, Marlene, kept his last letter folded in a shoebox for 30 years, a postcard with a crooked sailboat and the inside reading, "I'll be back before leaves fall." She kept hoping she had misread it. She kept hoping he'd arrive at that back door like someone who had stepped out to fetch milk and been late with the time. The town had married her hope to stubbornness. Neighbors fed her dinners and pretended part of the story didn't exist. Grief, they learned, sat easier when it was arranged into neat, polite silence. Now the silence cracked. Detective Lila Hart answered the first call that afternoon. She had been a young detective when Kelvin disappeared. Tall, impatient, not yet convinced the world would forgive her for not being faster. She had cut her teeth on missing person investigations. Teenagers who ran away, elders who wandered off and walked into rivers, husbands who left because leaving was easier than love. Kelvin's case had lodged in her like a splinter. It had not mattered that a decade, 2, then 3, rolled by. She had kept the file on a high shelf in her attic, the corners softened by search requests, and the faint fingerprints of a woman who never let anything go. Now at 57, with a back that protested long nights and a laugh that came from the bottom of her chest, Lila stood beneath the ridge and watched pale fingers of sunlight pick out an old dog tag. The tag lay against a jawbone. It was small, dull, and stubbornly human. She read the stamped name aloud and felt her voice break on the last syllable. Kelvin A. Bush. Service number. Unit. Date of birth. For some people, the truth is a thing that can arrive on a single scrap of metal. For others, it is slow and bitter. For Marlene, truth arrived first as a knock at the door. They say you can teach an old person to live with anything, but the moment they open that front door and another person says a child's name, the house rearranges itself. Lila didn't say much. She handed Marlene a business card and reached for the shoebox. Marlene didn't have to be told. She produced the postcard as a reflex that had nothing to do with memory, more like a ritual. When Lila laid Kelvin's dog tag against the postcard, the world made a sound like a low bell. The forensic team worked with a patient, merciless precision. Bones speak in their own language. Healed fractures, blunt force trauma, the way dirt ribbed lines across the tibia. Modern forensics listened where earlier attempts had only heard static. Teeth gave up their secrets, matching dental records Kelvin's family had kept, and astonishingly, a fragment of mitochondrial DNA matched Marlene's, small, stubborn proof that the child who had vanished and the woman who kept his postcard were, in the most stubborn way, connected. They brought Kelvin home in a cardboard coffin at the first glint of morning. The town's small church filled with people who had been 3 when he left, and who now wore the weather of decades across their faces. Old men who remembered Kelvin's boyhood mischief stood with their arms folded against themselves. Women clasped hands like the rope of a small boat. Children stared from the back pews at the space where a son had never come home. Lila watched Marlene sit forward in the pew, and when the lid of the coffin was lifted, the mother's face moved from hope to holy ruin. Kelvin looked smaller than any photograph had prepared them for. He had been 22 in the last photograph. Now he seemed to belong to the place they'd all kept him, an age that belonged to old afternoons and quiet rooms rather than to the urgent music of youth. There was a hole in the story no amount of DNA could fill. Teeth, tags, and the slope of cheekbones answer the question of who. They do not, on their own, answer the question of how. The how reopened a city of questions Lila had barricaded in her mind for years. Kelvin had been a soldier. Yes. He had been in the National Guard unit that trained on the Ridge, an assembly of men who called themselves brothers, and who had secrets like other men kept cigarettes. Some had moved into town and taken quiet jobs at the post office or at the mill. Others had jerked free of small-town gravity and never returned. The longest shadow among them belonged to Major Carlton Hayes, who had been in charge of the unit. Hayes retired into local business influence and a network of favors the town never quite saw. If the truth, 40 years later, was going to speak, it would speak around Hayes. Lila had thought that then, and she would hold that thought like a lantern for months, even as other possibilities glared. The Ridge had been a training ground in '85, mornings of ruck marches and late-night letters home. The men trained in the kind of camaraderie that melts fear but can mask cruelty. There were names in the file: Ray Mercer, Daniel Dane Lowe, young men with voices that had changed with time, faces that had folded into all of what life asks of men. The case file had interviews dated the day Kelvin vanished. Some interviews read like shrapnel. Ray had said, "We were drunk. We argued. Kelvin left." Dane had said less. The major had been terse. Kelvin deserted. The papers had accepted the easy answer, closed the file, and moved on. Now the bones refused the easy answer. At the autopsy, the forensic anthropologist traced a thin crescent of healed perimortem fractures on the left cheek. That suggested a blunt instrument. The pelvis held a puncture that suggested something sharp, too deliberate to be an accident. There was a partial fingerprint on the dog tags chain, a smudge of oil that modern techniques could lift from dust and decades. It was a fingertip that matched a living man on a list Lila had kept as if it were a rosary. Daniel Lowe. Not Dane the boy, but Daniel Lowe, the community pharmacist, the man who had given Marlene discount on medicine the last 5 years and who had sent her flowers when the church choir sang for the dead. When Lila went to the Lowe house, Daniel answered in slippers as if the knocking were a small thing and the detective had been more of a visitor than an accusation. He had the same eyes as the photograph in the file, small, watery, the corners crinkled in a habitual smugness. "You'll have reason to take me," he said, and his voice was a soft unmaking. He didn't attempt to run. He had, as a man who had lived with more than his share of secrets, perhaps been waiting for the time when the world would make him account. Daniel didn't confess that night, not in the small kitchen under the humming fridge light where he offered the detective weak coffee. But he let Lila see how other men had treated him, how he carried himself among those with favors. He mentioned Hayes with careless cruelty, the way men soften hate with other men's names. It was the major's idea, he said, not quite a confession and not quite a denial. Kelvin knew. He was a problem. Lila left with the coffee cup. She walked back through a town that felt smaller and more dangerous now that the truth had been touched. The county prosecutor, a man whose face had settled in rompers of doubt and civility, took an interest not because he loved justice, but because the bones made it politically necessary. He agreed to bring charges for obstruction and for being accessory after the fact if they could tie Hayes to a chain of events. It took months of interviews, of poring over old ledgers and new bank statements. It took Lila and 2 younger detectives sitting in libraries and scanning microfilm until their eyes pooled. It took them talking to men who didn't want to talk, and to women who had loved the men who wouldn't tell the truth. They looked for the skeletons in the major's investment portfolio and found more than skeletons. Hayes had done something that good men and bad men do when small-town systems are built of favors rather than law. He had used servicemen to move things that didn't look like they belonged inside a military convoy. It wasn't a blockbuster trafficking ring, no towering cartel, no cinematic violence. It was smaller, the type of sin that slid easily into gray pockets. Guns sold under the table, some diverted to men who liked to test the world. Others routed through men who wanted cash and disdain. Kelvin, it emerged, had discovered discrepancies in inventories, the ledger that didn't square. He had asked questions, the kind of questions men are taught not to ask if they plan to keep being fed. He had written to his mother about them. Once, in a letter she had tucked into that same shoebox, handwriting cramped. "They say it's ours, Mother. But it's not, it's for some of them." Kelvin had threatened to go to the press or to the Inspector General. That much the men agreed on, and agreement smelled like guilt. There had been a fight at the Ridge that night in '85 that one man later said had been about theft, another that it was about who slept with whose girlfriend. In the raw swirl of booze and bravado, Kelvin had walked away. Someone said they saw him hitchhike down Route 12. Someone else said he had packed and left town. The file contained 10 versions of the same story, because memory shapes itself to whatever is least dangerous. What unspooled now was the quiet, grinding evidence of small corruptions. Hayes had kept men close by obliging them. He had once made Daniel an unofficial courier. The motive, in the end, was not the grandeur of conspiracy, but the small arithmetic of fear. Kelvin would burn them. So they burned him instead. The chain tightened. The fingerprint on the dog tag was not the final blow, but it was the hinge. Phone records from a rural payphone, faded and near impossible, finally fell into Lila's hands between pleading calls and the determined slow parts of the prosecutor's office. A landowner's journal, misfiled in an auction lot years prior, contained a name list of guards scheduled near the Ridge that night. A handyman remembered seeing Daniel's truck return with fresh dirt under its wheel wells. Ray, guilt-ravaged and tired, came clean on a November evening while the heater rattled and his hands trembled. "It was supposed to be a scare," he said. He tapped a cigarette ash into the sink like it was soft. "We didn't mean it like that." Hayes said, "Make him shut up." He said it in a voice that didn't ask. Ray's apology was not a confession of the hand that struck the final blow. It was something like an explanation of how a boy's courage can be corralled into coward's crimes. But the forensic detail, the puncture on the pelvic bone that matched the tip of a certain kind of ice pick, the way dirt packed into shoe tread that matched Daniel's boot brand, hung like a noose around the story. Hayes denied everything until the day he couldn't. He had friends in County Hall and lawyers with crisp speech and even a charity gala that raised money for veterans. When Lila confronted him in a room that smelled of lemon oil and old glue, he smiled with an ease that was practiced. "You're fishing in the past," he said. "You can't rewrite what has been." "You can if you admit it," Lila said, and she had the tired courage of someone who had waited decades to be heard. The man laughed, and then, under the pressure of things, he didn't have the face to keep up the joke. They produced a list of phone calls Hayes had made to Daniel in the week before Kelvin disappeared. They produced a ledger entry that hinted at payment to another man who had been quiet for a long time. The weight of evidence didn't fall at once. It piled brick by brick. Justice is seldom a tsunami. It is usually slow, inexorable, and made of dull small things that don't look like endings. At the arraignment, Hayes sat like a man who had been souffled, delicate, shocked, the room's light unforgiving. He pleaded not guilty. The town's newspapers called it the trial of the century, because small-town crimes rarely made bigger news than a dog bite or a disputed fence line. But as the trial pulled townspeople into courtrooms, the fabric of community unraveled in ways that were both quiet and loud. Friendships that had been stitched together by convenience frayed. Old men who had looked the other way now had to justify the turning. For Marlene, the trial opened a different kind of wound. She sat through testimony, remembering the sound of Kelvin's voice reading off the name of a country in a letter he had sent. She tried to imagine truth as a thing that had been walking a long time in the dark. What made the trial shocking was less the violence of the murder, Though the idea of how a man had been struck down was itself terrible, then the realization that the town's pillars had been built on commerce that had not been clean. Hayes had been a hero in parades and in photographs. He had given money to the Legion and presided over ribbon cuttings. The worst part, people whispered, was that even his enemies had bent their lives around his generosity because it bought them space, favors, silence. The town had been a map of gray lines. The prosecution called a small army of witnesses. Ray with his tremor, the man who had cataloged equipment that didn't match the ledgers, the former girlfriend who had seen Kelvin arguing, a woman who had been tipped off years earlier and was finally willing to finger the burnt seam of a secret that had blistered her conscience. Lila watched each witness and felt a strange, lacerating relief. The truth was not vindication. It was a verdict. It was Daniel who finally spoke in such a way that the room felt like a throat being unblocked. He had been called as a defense witness. He had sat through the prosecution's roll call, and in the pause between exhibits, he looked at the jury and then at Hayes. When he started to talk, his voice had absorbed the years. "I didn't mean to kill him," he said. "I swear, Lila, I didn't mean to. We were supposed to rough him up, make him leave." Hayes said. He said Kelvin had to be taught a lesson. "I hit him. He didn't get up. I panicked. I thought if we buried him, maybe time would take him. It didn't take him. It took us." There were moments in court where the world rearranges. For Marlene, the confession was both a blade and a bomb. She had wanted, for 40 years, to know the shape of what had taken her son. Now that shape had bone and voice. But even as Daniel's words made a map of truth, there were things the trial could not put back together. The long years of wondering, the nights the family had eaten in silence, the years of being watched from porches in case a familiar silhouette might return. Hayes' defense was a cocktail of plausible deniability and a man's pleaded ignorance. He had been careful. He had let others dirty their hands. The jury found Hayes guilty of conspiracy and major counts related to obstruction and accessory. The sentence, years of federal time, did not make the town any less raw. Men who had once walked past each other at the bakery now looked with the knowledge of whispers. The parade's ribbons hung like mockery. The most unexpected and the quietest victory belonged to Kelvin in a way no court could record. When the case finished and the town washed back into its routine, people found themselves speaking Kelvin's name like an exhale. Children who hadn't been born when he disappeared learned that he had been someone the town had lost and finally found. Marlene, who had kept his postcard in a shoebox under the bed, tore the shoebox and spread its contents on the kitchen table like sacrament. There were photographs of his laugh, a crumpled ticket stub from a movie, a cigarette lighter that read, "Always," in a jaunty script. She read his letters and, for the first time in 40 years, added a line of her own to the loose pile. "You came back," she told the air. "You came home." Kelvin's son, Thomas Bush, arrived in town halfway through the trial. He had been raised by a stepfather in a city that smelled of noise and neon. He had found late one night his mother's postcard that had been stuck in a second-hand book. He had traced the name with a thumb and felt, all at once, like a missing seam had been found. He had called the number on an old obituary. He had been a stranger to the town, but he brought with him the mechanized courage of younger men who demand the facts and won't be soothed by pity. Thomas stood at the back of the courtroom, tall and hollow-eyed, and after the trial, he walked up to the small cardboard coffin they had used in the funeral rites and knelt. He ran his hands over the wood like a man trying to read Braille. For him, the story never became clean. The truth didn't have the heroic tidy edges of the movies. It was a slow wash, sawdust, pills of disbelief, quiet visits to the place where Kelvin had been placed in the ground so long ago that no one remembered the way the soil had been groomed to keep information. In the months after, the town planted trees along the new road that cut through the ridge where Kelvin's bones had been found. They planted oaks with promises that they would grow tall and shade the lives of people who would never know. Marlene attended the first planting and placed the postcard in the earth as if seed. She told the arborist, voice trembling and fierce, "Make sure you remember his name." The arborist wrote it in the ledger. Lila kept the file on her desk, but it looked different now. It was not a closed box of regrets, but a thin, hard-edged proof that the world could right some wrongs if people refused to let them lie. She had spent 40 years holding a lantern to one small part of wrong. The light had been enough to show what, in the end, had been hidden. The town changed in ways both small and absolute. The Legion sold the Major's portrait and returned the money to veterans programs. The mill, embarrassed by the association of names, donated back to scholarships. People who had turned their faces away now visited Marlene on Sundays. The town could not undo the years any more than it could return a child's stolen time, but it could change the stories it told its children. Kelvin, whose life had been a bright thread snipped, became in death something of a caution and a talisman. Young guards were taught by their commanders not only about drills, but about the consequences of the quiet complicities that let men do harm. Hayes taught them, unwillingly, about the way power can rust. The last scene belonged not to the courtroom or to the grave, but to an ordinary evening. Thomas sat by the ridge where the trees were small but planted and held in his hand a watch Kelvin had worn in the last photograph. The watch had been returned to him when his father's things were sorted. It was dented and slow and kept time fitfully, as if time itself were still honoring the man who had been lost. He opened the back and found, inside, a tiny folded paper. It was Kelvin's handwriting, cramped, certain. "If anything happens," it read, "tell Marlene I tried." The line was as simple and as awful as anything else. It meant Kelvin had been frightened, but had intended to do the right thing. It meant he had not been running to forget, but running toward truth. The paper caught in Thomas's throat, and the watch slipped from his fingers and kissed the earth. In the town's new quiet, people sometimes stopped on the road and stared at the line of oaks. The saplings were still tender, their roots not yet knotted deep. They put ribbons on their branches on the anniversary of Kelvin's finding, and children's voices asked the elders questions that had been shushed for too long. The elders told them the story without coloring it with excuses. They told them that men who love their town must also love its honesty. They told them names straight out so they could be called and not turned away like a bad odor. There is a way that truth, once found after years of being buried, reshapes everything. It does not mend what has been broken. It does not return the years to the ones who lost them. But it lays down a map on which the living can step. For Marlene, the map was a poor comfort that she nevertheless carried like a comb in her pocket. Useful, plain, necessary. For Thomas, it was the beginning of a life where he could speak his father's name without averting his eyes. For Lila, it was a vindication. The world had not been fair, but it had been, finally, just. On the 40th anniversary of the night Kelvin had disappeared, the town gathered by the ridge. They walked across the tall grasses under a low sky and planted another tree, tall enough now that it shaded the newborn saplings. Marlene laid her palm against the trunk and then, slowly, she touched the dirt. She spoke without ceremony. "Kelvin," she said, "you were always my son. I kept waiting. I forgive you for not coming home. I'm glad you are." There is a kind of forgiveness that is an act of survival. There is another that is the first true acknowledgement of damage. Marlene's was both. The town listened like a congregation learning a new liturgy, and in the hush a crow called, and the wind took the sound away. They would never forget the fact of how cheaply life had been valued in the days when favors bought silence. They would not let the lessons lay dormant. There were hearings and reforms and a slow rewiring of power. Justice had been served in the small way courts can serve it, but the real work was community level and slow, rebuilding trust, teaching young men not to mistake silence for wisdom. Kelvin's remains had been discovered by chance. The chance had opened a door no apology could close. But chance had also returned something priceless, a name, a face, the particular arrangement of a laugh. In the end, that was what people wanted, the understanding that a life had mattered, that the world had been shamed into admitting it had taken something, and had finally, belatedly, told the truth. When the town finally shut the courthouse doors at the end of the grand innings and the reporters had left, Lila sat at the graveside with a paper cup of coffee gone cold. She had been young when the case began and old when it had ended. She had watched too many dead men become statistics. She tapped the dog tag with a gloved finger and thought of Kelvin as a man who had been brave enough to be inconvenient. "You did well," she said out loud, perhaps because some people need to hear praise, even after death. For Marlene and Thomas, and for the town that relearned itself, the words were not enough, and they were all that remained. The skeletal truth of what had happened could not fix 40 years, but it could stop the quiet continuation of a lie. When they buried Kelvin again, this time in a small plot with an honest stone and the dates of his life and the story of his finding etched beneath, the inscription read simply, Kelvin A. Bush, beloved son, beloved father, soldier, missing found. It was not an ending anyone would call neat. It was not a cure. It was finally an answer. And in that answer, the town found the small, fierce luxury of knowing. The winter after the trial, the town learned that not all ghosts leave once the truth is spoken. Strange things began to happen near the ridge. Hunters swore they heard footsteps pacing just beyond their firelight, boots heavy in the dirt though no one was there. A jogger claimed he saw a figure in fatigues watching from the tree line, then vanish when headlights swept across. The sheriff brushed it off as nerves, but people who had known Kelvin whispered that the soldier had come back to stand guard over the place he had died. For Marlene, the haunting was quieter, more intimate. She would wake to the sound of her back door creaking open, the same way Kelvin used to sneak in late from drills. Once she swore she heard his voice calling, "Ma," so soft she thought she had dreamed it. When she looked at the shoebox of letters, the folded edges fluttered though the windows were shut tight. She began to believe her son had unfinished business that even justice in a courtroom could not settle. Lila, too, felt it. She had spent nights going over the trial transcripts, replaying Daniel's trembling voice, Hayes's hollow denials. But what lingered with her wasn't the victory. It was the puncture wound in the bone, the force of a blow that had been meant to silence. She dreamed of Kelvin almost every week, standing in the shadows of a ridge, eyes hollow but steady, pointing toward the trees as though something still waited to be uncovered. One cold evening, as dusk melted into black, Thomas Bush returned to the ridge alone. He carried his father's dented watch, ticking faintly like a stubborn heartbeat. He walked where the oaks now stood, small but unbowed, and listened to the wind hiss through their leaves. Then, without meaning to, he whispered, "Dad, are you here?" The reply came not in words, but in the crash of a branch falling yards away, the echo rolling like a rifle crack. Thomas froze, the watch slipping from his palm. When he bent to retrieve it, he saw something half buried in the dirt, a rusted metal box, so eaten with years that it split under his fingers. Inside lay a stack of papers, brittle and stained, training logs, equipment lists, and, at the very top, a sheet with Hayes's name scrawled beside shipments that were never meant to exist. Thomas's breath caught. It wasn't over. Kelvin hadn't just died for discovering their crimes. He had died trying to leave behind the evidence that would damn them. The soldiers thought they had buried him deep enough to erase the truth. But even in death, he had found a way to point back to it. When Thomas handed the papers to Lila the next morning, her hand shook. "He's still talking to us," she whispered. "Even from the grave, he won't let them rest." The documents would ripple outward, reaching men who thought they had escaped, pulling at old networks that had long gone to seed. Hayes would die in prison, but others would finally be named. And yet, the chilling part, the part no one spoke too loudly, was this. The ridge had given up its secret only because Kelvin wanted it to. The soldier who vanished hadn't really been lost. He had been waiting, 40 years buried, and still fighting. Every year after, on the anniversary of his disappearance, townsfolk left lanterns burning by the ridge. Some swore the lights flickered in unison, as though a figure in uniform passed among them, inspecting, guarding, making sure the truth stayed alive. Kelvin Bush had been missing for decades. Now he was found, but the way his presence lingered fierce and watchful, it seemed clear to everyone. Kelvin would never truly leave again. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on the notification bell, so you stay updated with mystery stories that strike a chord. Thanks for watching.